Hello everyone, it's Liz. Welcome back to my sewing room. Today I'm going to talk about quilt binding again. Quilt binding is exciting because it means you're so close to finishing your project, and I think it's pretty fun to make. There are three kinds of quilt binding that I like to use: cross grain, bias, and continuous strip. In this episode I'll show you how to make bias and cross grain binding. Continuous strip binding will have its own tutorial since the process is a bit different. Let's take a look at the different types of binding and how you can make binding strips for your project. Cross grain binding is probably the easiest type to make. For this, fold your fabric in half with the selvages together and make another fold if necessary to make sure that your fabric fits on your cutting board. Now cut strips to the desired binding width. I like to use 2 1/4 inch strips to make double fold binding, but you can use 2 1/2 inch strips if you like. Make enough strips to complete your project, making sure that the grain of the fabric stays straight. One thing you'll notice about cross grain binding is that when you fold your strips in half, a single thread runs along the edge, and this thread is going to receive a lot of wear. On bias binding, the wear is spread across many diagonal threads, so that's one thing to think about. Another thing to consider is the type of project that you're binding. Bias strips work great for square and rectangular projects, as well as ovals and quilts with scalloped edges, because the strips are so flexible. Another advantage is that bias strips don't fray, which is really nice when you're handling your binding and attaching it to your quilt. To make binding cut on the bias, measure and cut a fabric square. You can use a full width square or a smaller square around 18 inches. Fold opposite tips together, make a nice crease, and then fold the ends together so your square is in quarters. Now when you make your first cut, it will be along these double folds. Since the fabric is already doubled, your first cut will equal half the width of your binding. So if I want to make 2 1/4 inch strips, my first cut will be 1 1/8 of an inch. After that, the cuts will be full width of the binding. Once you have enough strips for your project, it's time to join the ends together. Lay your strips together, the right sides facing each other, so the ends are perpendicular. Now you'll make a seam going from corner to corner. For this part, you want to use a smaller stitch around 1.8 or 2 millimeters for extra strength. The thing you don't want to do is go from the outside corner to the very inside corner. If you'll do that, you'll end up with one of these useless things, which I've made many times. And if you do it right, it will unfold perfectly. The last thing you need to do, just trim off your seam allowance here. Take your strips to your ironing board, press the seam open, fold your strips in half, and iron to make that fold permanent. Now your binding is ready to go. If you haven't, check out my episode on binding quilts to get started. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.